Welcome everyone joining us around Australia and the world, both in person and online, to this public panel on the topic The Australian Labor Party and the Left, hosted by the Melbourne chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. My name is Ryan Nickler and I'll be the moderator for this event. This is the third Platypus panel ever hosted in Melbourne on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we thank the audience for being in attendance. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006 in Chicago, organises reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old left of the 1920s and 1930s, the new left of the 1960s and 1970s, and the post-political left of the 1980s to 1990s for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. You can learn more about our activities on Facebook and Instagram through @Platypus Melbourne, or by visiting our website, www.platypus1917.org. We also have a podcast called Shit Platypus Says, which can be streamed on SoundCloud, and a monthly open access publication called Platypus Review. Platypus Melbourne also runs a reading group where we go through a yearly syllabus from Rousseau to Marx to Lenin to Adorno, trying to understand what Marxism was. There are two streams of this reading group running concurrently. One stream meets in person on Mondays in Carlton and the other on Wednesday nights in Zoom for Australia-wide participation. The panel topic for today is the ALP and the left, and the panellists have been asked to respond to the following prompt. The Australian Labor Party constituted the first national Labor government in the world, emerging from the various Labor parties founded prior to Australia's federation. Since that time, groups on the left have held different views of the ALP, and at particular junctures they have opposed or supported the ALP for distinct reasons. In what way does the left today inherit tasks and problems from the history of those various positions, from the 1960s to 70s new left, the 1920s to 30s old left, and socialist politics before and after federation? Given that history, what is the meaning of socialist politics in the present, and what does it have to do with the ALP? Our format is simple. Each of the four speakers will have around 10 minutes for opening remarks, and then 4 to 5 minutes after everyone has spoken to respond to fellow panelists before an hour or so of audience Q&A. If time permits, we'll also take questions from the online audience. And our speakers for today are, read out in agreed upon speaking order, Verity Burgmann was a member of the British Socialist Workers Party in the 1970s, a member of the Australian International Socialists in the early 1980s. Today, she's an eco-Marxist activist and intellectual with syndicalist sympathies. She's a labour historian and adjunct professor at Monash University. Max Ogden, a former member of the Communist Party of Australia and the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union Victoria, beginning as a metalwork apprentice to shop steward and then a trade union's educational officer, where he worked with and alongside the greats of the Australian Union and ALP movements such as Laurie Carmichael, Bob Hawke and Bill Kelty. He's an author of the recent autobiographical book, A Long View from the Left. David McMullen was a member of the Red Eureka movement in the late 70s and early 80s, a group that opposed the 1976 counter-revolution in China and supported the Maoist line of continuing the revolution under the dictatorship of the proletariat, with the capitalist roaders in the party being the prime target. At the moment, his main interest is exploring the problem of transforming the relations of production after the revolution. Kevin Healy, former member of the ALP Socialist Left and radio presenter at 3CR Community Radio. He was on the ALP executive that was sacked by federal intervention in 1970. For the Q&A, I hope to call in only questions. If you in the audience have more of a comment, then I encourage you to work into a short piece of writing and submit it to our international open journal, the Platypus Review, where the transcript of this event will be published along with selected responses. This event will conclude in under 3 hours before 4 p.m. And with that, I'll hand it over to Verity, who will begin her opening remarks.
Thanks Ryan. I'll be attempting to give a very, very sketchy 130-year history of relations between the ALP and the left. Right back in the 1890s, socialists, including Marxists, were important in the founding of the Labor parties in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and I tell that story in my book, In Our Time, Socialism and the Rise of Labour. For example, in New South Wales in the 1890s, members of the Australian Socialist League were crucial, and of the 35 Labor MPs who entered the New South Wales Parliament in 1891, at least 8 were members. It was generally agreed that the task of this new party was to introduce socialism in our time. it didn't. Sorry about the spoiler. Socialist disillusionment with Labor was rapid. As early as January 1892, William Lane decided that the experiment of Labor in politics was already proving that it was disastrous, that he was horrified by unionists scrambling over each other to get seats into Parliament, and pointed out that once you sent people into Parliament, the Labor movement lost all control over them. So he and 700 other socialists founded a utopian socialist colony in Paraguay instead. They were that disappointed. In 1898, the ASL members who'd done so much to establish the New South Wales Labor Party departed it en masse, saying it had degenerated into a mere vote-catching machine, following a policy of compromise. The ASL renamed itself the Socialist Labor Party and stood against the Labor Party in the first Senate elections in 1901. It called the ALP the bogus Labor Party and its official organ the Shirker for failure to represent working class interests. It said caucus consisted of opportunists eager to sell out the workers at every opportunity. The total number of votes cast for the 6 Socialist Labor Party candidates in New South Wales was 1,091,393. The SLP argued that only it was Marxist enough, good enough, pure enough not to betray the workers. Now, there was another rather less sectarian Marxist grouping in Australia at the time, the Socialist Federation of Australia, with different branches by different names in the different colonies and states. For example, the Social Democratic Federation of Western Australia attacked the first Western Australian Labor government in 1904 for a serious falling off in the ideals of the Labor Party in office compared with in opposition. Now, the perceived problem wasn't the stated aims of the party, but lack of urgency to achieve these. The 1905 objective committed caucus to the securing of the full results of their industry to all producers by collective ownership of monopolies and the extension of the industrial and economic functions of the state and municipality. The largest of the SFA socialists was the Victorian Socialist Party under Tom Magg, the British trade union leader, who'd come to Australia to see whether a social laboratory country like Australia, with very early successful labour parties by world standards, could bring about a modification of capitalism. But by 1905, he decided no and resigned as an organiser for the Victorian Labor Party and founded the Victorian Socialist Party, saying that there'd been too much emphasis on Labor parliamentarians and that this had distracted from industrial organisation. That was the much better, reliable defence of wages and conditions. Now, Labor was in office federally 1910 to 1913 and again 1914 to 1917, and their behaviour confirmed such attitudes on the left, that despite parliamentary majorities achieved 35 years before British Labor, Labor governments here were not abolishing capitalism or even bad paying conditions. Now, Lenin famously wrote about the ALP in 1913, describing it as a liberal bourgeois party, and most Marxists followed this lead, arguing that a different party was needed, more emphasis on that rather than looking at a different strategy. But there was also growing discontent with the whole idea of the parliamentary strategy. There was a rise of syndicalist sentiments in the 1900s and 1910s in particular, and certainly the industrial workers of the world wobblies grew because of disappointment with Labor politicians. The Wobblies argued for revolutionary industrial unionism and against parliamentary activity as a solution for working class problems. Tom Barker explained that the experience of Labor politicians made him absolutely convinced that you needed a strong and ruthless industrial organisation to see that people were properly protected and properly paid. And as you probably know, the best Wobbly song was Bump Me Into Parliament, which I won't sing. My favourite verse is, "Oh yes, I am a Labor man and believe in revolution. The quickest way to bring it on is talking constitution." The OAWW argued that Labor MPs had far too congenial an atmosphere in Parliament to stand up for workers in struggle. They would naturally put their material interests before those of the working class, that the worst use you could make of a member of the working class was to place him in Parliament. Building the OBU was the only reliable route to socialism. So this was really the first wholehearted critique of the strategy of Labour in politics, and not just of those chosen to perform that strategy. Then the 1920s and the Bolshevik Revolution and the founding of the CPA in the early 1920s. In 1920, Lenin had recommended that communists support Labour parties like a rope supports the hanging man, so that workers would lose their illusions in such parties and turn to the Communist Party. And the infant CPA followed the Comintern policy of the United Front. So in the early 20s, CPA members worked within unions, joined Labour Party branches. They were aiming to unmask Labour leaders, recruit workers dissatisfied with them and so on. The 1922 Communist Party resolution on the Labour Party said it was the political expression of the working class, but its aims and ideals were anti-revolutionary because the workers themselves lacked class consciousness, so the CPA was going in to fix it. The ALP retaliated with bans on dual card holders. In the meantime, in 1923, the world-famous Australian Marxist prehistorian Vere Gordon Child published his How Labour Governs, which was inspired by his time as secretary to Labour Premier John Story in New South Wales. And this period of Child's participation in the Labour Party in 1919 to 1921 was a high point of socialist influence. It had led to the 1921 conference objective of the socialisation of industry, production, distribution and exchange. But that objective, as always, proved elusive. Child argued it was elusive because the elected representatives of Labour were not properly accountable to working class electors or even to the party as a whole. And he described the process by which opportunist politicians came to control the movement through structural changes in the party's organisation, which ensured that the party bodies there to control the politicians were in fact dominated by politicians. So the ground rule of Labour in politics, control of the politicians by the movement, was turned upside down. So he says the Labour Party, starting with a band of inspired socialists, degenerated into a vast machine for capturing political power, but did not know how to use that power except for the profit of individuals. Well, by the late 1920s, the CPA's United Front tactic had changed into the third period Stalinism of class against class, in which the Labour Party is condemned as a social fascist party. But the CPA balked at applying third period tactics to trade union work. By the mid-30s, the CPA had reoriented back to a United Front from below or popular front strategy, campaigning with Labour members against the common threat of fascism. The CPAs had realised that abusing Labour MPs and union officials had been counterproductive, that it actually alienated the activists they'd been trying to reach. But Labour had been so put off by being called social fascists that they weren't interested in popular front work with the CP, so the CPA was sort of obliged to make a virtue out of necessity and to concentrate on work in the unions. Now, after the USSR's invaded in June 1941, the CPA obviously tempers its critique of the Labour Party in government, but that truce unravels after the war, with the beginnings of the Cold War, and especially with the 1949 coal strike waged under CPA leadership of the miners' union. The Labour politicians were condemned for freezing union funds, jailing union leaders and using troops as strike-breaking labour. The CPA argued that the strike proved that the arbitration system upheld by Labour MPs was a vicious bludgeon against the working class. And that kind of argument about Labour's caution on industrial issues, its lack of commitment to abolishing the penal clauses of the arbitration system, was the focus of CPA criticism in the 1950s and 1960s. And from the 60s, CPA criticism of Labour was joined by new left critics who condemned Labour MPs' lack of commitment to working class struggles, and also raised again the arguments of the IWW and Child that well-paid representatives in Parliament would misrepresent the working class. In 1970, Humphrey McQueen's in New Britannia said that the record of the ALP proved Robert Michel's iron law of oligarchy, that the organisation, despite its democratic structures, was dominated by politicians who used their positions for personal rather than working class advancement. And New Left commentary builds on McQueen's ideas to develop the notion of technocratic labourism, the removal of old-style paleo-labourites such as Call, replacement with politicians such as Whitlam and Don Dunstan, well-educated professionals. They didn't own substantial controlling capital or productive power, but they were nonetheless very, very different from the previous breed of Labor leaders. So they're progressive socially, but deeply critical of ideologies such as class struggle and working class power. And these people were taking over the Labor Party and moving it from a party that represented the working class to one determined to manage capitalism more efficiently. And this is the theme of Bob Catley and Bruce McFarlane's 1974 book, From Tweedledum to Tweedledee. Labor politicians, they said, had shifted away from concern with redistribution, funded by progressive taxation, towards an emphasis on economic growth to contain distributional tensions. And this opportunism, noted by the New Left critics, was used to explain both the declining economic egalitarianism of Labor and also its increasing social progressivism. Catley and McFarlane argued that Labor was listening to the new social movements with considerably greater attention than it did to industrial militants, because these new movements were acting to defuse class politics and also to broaden the Labor Party's electoral base. After the Whitlam government, R.W. Connell's ruling class, ruling culture in 1977 noted that the Whitlam government had really only squeezed through the mildest of redistributive measures, that it had even imposed a pastoral wage freeze on the union movement, that it was moving towards accommodation with mining and manufacturing capital, that Whitlamism was about making capitalism more efficient rather than more just. Even that had been intolerable to sections of the ruling class. The Kirkuk was a ruling class mobilisation, but a complete overreaction. Now, the Trotskyists in the early post-war period were mainly following classical Trotskyism's line that a party like Labor should be supported, like a rope supports a hanging man. Mostly they pursued the tactic of entrism, actively joining the Labor Party and working within it. Bob Gould, George Peterson in New South Wales are prime examples here. By the 70s, the largest Trotskyist group is the Socialist Workers League with its paper Direct Action. It had a dual policy of promoting its own profile, but also working inside the ALP. But in the early to mid-80s, the Socialist Workers League recanted on this. It rebranded itself as the Democratic Socialist Party. It's noted that Australian socialists had been duped into thinking that the ALP was a working class party and that workers should therefore vote for it. They said we suffered from inheriting a Trotskyist scheme of prescribing entry into the Labor Party as a universal timeless tactic, but then it developed a more Leninist analysis, and so the DSP got into party building to compete electorally with Labor, leading ultimately at the end of around the turn of the millennium with the formation of Socialist Alliance and Green Left Weekly. All Trotskyists were distinguishing themselves from the Communist Party in these last couple of decades of the 20th century. They honed in on CPA softness on the Hawke and Keating governance, especially the way communist and former communist officials supported the Accord. They really attacked Laurie Carmichael of the Metal Workers Union, for example. For example, in 1986, Socialist Action published Labor's Accord, Why It's a Fraud, which argued that the Accord was the Labor government's way to solve the crisis of Australian capitalism caused by the declining tendency of the rate of profit. They were just interested in running capitalism in ways that protected the interests of the employing class. Now, also at this time, there were lots of critical accounts of Hawke and Keating governments from Marxist academics, and they pointed out the way that the Labor governments had promoted neoliberal policies to assist globalisation, even though these reversals of traditional Labor policies were unpopular with working class voters because they increased class inequalities. A slightly different critique was mounted in 1999 by Michael Thompson, who argued that the ALP had alienated working class voters because it had been taken over by tertiary educated professionals who'd imposed social agendas hostile to blue-collar culture. But as the other academic critics pointed out, it was actually the neoliberalism of Labor, much more than its social agendas, that alienated workers, imposed wage restraint, privatisation, deregulation, etc. So after the Communist Party had wound itself up in the early 1990s, there were many attempts to form a new left party, encouraged by the Hawke and Keating governments, the Broad Left, the New Left Party, the New Labour Party, the Rainbow Alliance, etc. None of these really lasted long. Socialist Alliance remained the largest socialist grouping electorally, but has really made little headway against Labor, with most of the anti-Labor left more inclined to vote Green as a way of protesting against Labor's mildness. But are Green protest voters more concerned about the betrayals on social issues such as refugees than Labor's backdowns on economic issues? On the other hand, you can point to ways in which the Greens have battled for better climate policies on grounds much more critical of free market capitalism than Labor has ever mounted. Thank you.
Thanks, Verity. All right, next up we have Max.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. I was in the Communist Party from 1959 when I had been active in the youth part of the, after as an apprentice in the what was in the Melbourne Engineering Union. And I'd come out of a left-wing family. My father had been in the Communist Party, joined like so many during the Depression. And also I joined because the people I was working with in our union were very fine people, hard-working and committed people like Laurie Carmichael, Halfpenny and Alan Ritter, a whole stack of them who were just great people. And I'd been in the Eureka Youth League before that. And so I was also, at that period, I was part of the younger forces who began to battle against the old Stalinist way of operating within the party, and was part of those forces that then argued strongly against the Maoist line when in 1963 we had the conference here, that state conference in particular here, to move away from that line, which was beginning to have quite an impact, but the over 80% of the party were opposed to that position. And then of course, so in that 25 years I spent about 20 of it as in the Victorian League Committee and also in the National Committee. And then of course there was the battle against the Soviet liners, particularly. We were already a long way moving. I'd already, on 3 occasions, been to the Soviet Union, and particularly on the last 2 occasions, came away pretty disillusioned from what I was seeing. The lack of democracy and the poor way workers were treated. For example, you visit factories and you'd find an appalling occupational health and safety situation compared to here. When I'd say we're much better here than there. And anyway, that was all part of the disillusion. Then of course we got very excited about the what was happening in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Very excited actually, and I remember having, as I describe in my book, an argument with Laurie Carmichael at the time. Very excited one morning about all the things that were unfolding there, and Laurie said, "But the party's losing control." And I remember saying, "But that's the bloody point." And of course, then the tragedy of the Warsaw Pact invasion, and I got a phone call about 2 a.m. From my colleague Barry Blairs, who at the time was working with the World Federation of Democratic Youth, to tell me about it. And I actually cried. I just sat out. and that was the end for me in terms of any hope of those countries providing a worthwhile example that people might think was worth examining. So, but the party took the right line. We were the first party in the world to condemn the invasion, so although a couple left at the time, most people, because we'd taken a principled position, stayed, and then of course we had the intervention of the Soviet Party, and then the big conference in 1970, which led to those people again, about 20% of them leaving the party. Then of course right from then on, it was open to develop what eventually was, I'd say without doubt, the most democratic political party in Australia. I mean, the terrific discussions and the like we had about strategy and so on were quite open and discussed it in very vigorous ways.
One second, we just lost the connection for one. The Wi-Fi just dropped out for a second. All right, continue.
Okay. So we made all those changes, but of course, despite all of that, and it was, I have to say, for those years, it was quite an exciting place to be. But the party still was declining in numbers, and a number of us finally decided in 1984 that despite everything, that the weight of the history of Stalinism was just too much for us to ever overcome, and the party was just going to keep declining, so there was no point in going down with the ship. So a whole lot of us left at the time. Some went and I've since raised the idea in the book that looking back now with 100 years of experience and hindsight, whether it was the wise move, whether forming communist parties, given the history, we should have happened. And I say, if I had been around, I would have joined it at the time. But I now would argue that we should have thought of other ways to do things than form a separate party. And actually, those days would have split a lot on the left. But you know, that's all history. So I joined the Labor Party, not with a lot of enthusiasm, I must say, but I knew quite a few fine people. Of course, I'd come through the union movement in '73. I became the full-time education officer for shop stewards training in the metal workers, which was a very exciting job. Loved every minute of it, and the opportunity to help our shop stewards. The whole objective was to help make workers, particularly shop stewards, self-acting as much as possible, and to try and equip them both with the daily skills they needed and also the knowledge, and particularly the knowledge about society and about capitalism and so on, so that they wouldn't always have to, they'd be much more self-acting. That was the whole objective of our work. But I joined the Labor Party, as I said, not with a lot of enthusiasm, but I couldn't see any other alternative. And I was soon invited to join the Socialist Left, which I only attended a handful of meetings and found them pretty dispiriting, quite frankly, because I'd come out of this recent few years of looking at the big picture, looking at strategies, trying to learn from all around the world what worked, and you go to an ALP Socialist Left faction, and there's none of that. Virtually none of that at all. It was all about focusing on this recommendation or this policy or who was going to be pre-selected. And I soon got to think, oh Christ, I'm not sure I'm so interested in all that stuff. So yeah, that lack of the big picture, and that's the big problem today, to this day, with the left. But having said that, there was a lot of fine people still to this day in the Labor Party. And but the other interesting thing about that period was that the Communist Party's demise opened up a whole lot of, over the first few years, I don't know how many, particularly left union, ALP left union officials, would say to me, oh God, we missed the party. You people always had some thoughts about strategy and where we should be going, and nobody now does that for us. a lot of good left people in the Labor Party, and my old comrades, Roger Wilson and Dave Davies and others like that, Jim Fraser, they all had a similar experience that those people complaining about how non-existent. So we had a lot. One thing about the Communist Party, more so than nearly any other one in the world actually, we had a lot of influence in the union movement, and we developed a whole lot of quite important union leaders, starting with people like Jim Healy and quite a few others, and I suppose the last line of those really nationwide people was Laurie Carmichael, and who was just brilliant at giving that strategic thinking. And now, just to finish up with what's the problem now, we don't have a proper forum much on the left for people to really think through strategic thinking, in the sense that, and this impacts the union movement too, I must say. The current union leadership, they're good people, the Sally McManuses and the like. I have not a lot of time for them, but there's none of the bigger thinking that used to go on. And at least the party, for example, when the ACU congresses would come up, would really think through and put up thoughtful policies. But even then, there was a weakness in that I began to realise that it's not just policies you need, it's strategies and strategic objectives, which should have two elements to them. One, looking in the track of the next 5 to 10 years, what is it that's important to achieve? That's not just about living standards, but that's very important, but how do we open up greater power? And secondly, what do we do right now, in this immediate tomorrow, Monday, that then works towards those strategies? And that's what's badly missing. We still kick where we see ahead, and there's no kind of collective, thoughtful, overall strategic stuff where you've got real themes running through it. For example, currently, I'm not sure what the policies are to change in industrial relations, but it seems to me there's a couple of strategic objectives we should have, particularly if there's a possibility of a Labor government. One should be winning back strategically the right to bargain across industries. Losing that, as I say in my book, I was opposed to enterprise bargaining, not enterprise bargaining itself, but enterprise bargaining without the industry-wide facility as well, which we were so successful at back in the 60s and 70s in the over-award campaign led by Carmichael, where you not only lifted the wage at the enterprise, you also lifted the wage in the award. I would have thought that's one of the key strategic objectives, and that you do that through pursuing wage increase. Just maybe I would say two issues: wages and shorter hours. And you get all the unions focused on that, and you begin. And even though it's illegal, you start to put demands on the industry as well as at the enterprise. For example, an extra 2 weeks leave a year, I would think would be attractive, and have a real go. And break the law on that issue of breaking pattern bargaining. But I don't see any of that kind of thinking taking place. And secondly, in a bigger part of the picture, I think the union movement should think very seriously about moving away strategically over time. You can't do it in one go. Moving away from reliance on the Fair Work Commission. And it's going to have some sort of role, but sideline it and make collective bargaining from the national to the industry, to the enterprise, the way we do everything. But again, you won't do that overnight. It's got to be done step by step. But you have the vision, have the objective that over 10 years, that's where we want to arrive at. So I'll leave it there. Fine, I'll just make this point. So I don't see, there's no kind of coherent left developing those ideas. And a lot of us have been thinking about for a while, how do we do that? What organisation, what people want to be part of that. Finally, very controversially, I've come to the conclusion, quite a few years ago, that I don't think as a matter of principle unions should be affiliated to any political party. I think they should always be independent, no matter what. We've seen the disasters when they were just an arm of the state in the Soviet Union and in China and so on. And then we've seen similar here, they get locked into situations which they don't always agree with. And I think actually you'd improve the relationship if they were independent and were able to negotiate everything at arm's length. I think it would actually improve rather than make the relationship worse for the Labor Party. And they do that with every party then. If you're independent, you negotiate with every party. And the other point arising from that is I've also been, given my experience, quite opposed to permanent factions. They just become so locked in and so inflexible. I'll make the point, I'm talking about permanent factions, where your loyalty to the faction become, and I saw it so often, the metal workers, people who, quite frankly, were good people, but bloody hopeless, being promoted because they were loyal to the faction, the left faction. Factions should come into being around ideas and strategic thinking, but not as hard and fast organisations, because, among other things, you have a situation where you might have a group of people come together, liaise about getting some policy issue up, which is perfectly legitimate. But on the next issue, there'll be a different group of people who want to get different policy. So you allow for people to change in their thinking and not have this artificial, left-right stuff. Because my experience is people change, and one time you can't work with them, next time you can. But the factions make it very difficult.
Thanks, Max. Next up, we have Dave McMullen.
People on the left have always had an ambivalent relationship with the ALP. However, they're always happy when they win elections and downcast when they lose. There's a perception that their policies are more progressive and favourable to the working class and low-income earners. I think the left and the ALP were furthest apart in the late 60s. I don't remember the ALP having any presence of the radical youth movement of that period. And I seem to recall the ALP announced Monash students answering the left campaign. The NLF was the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. In fact, Bob Hawke was on the University Council and was decidedly unhelpful. Back when virtually all blue-collar workers voted Labour, the common view was that the ALP was the party of the working class, and therefore it had to be supported. I never understood what that meant, but anyway, it's become pretty irrelevant because blue-collar workers are now just as likely to vote for coalition. I don't know if they still do, but I recall people citing Lenin favouring the election of the British Labour Party because it would expose the party in the eyes of the workers. Lenin took this position when the British Communist Party was trying to lure away politically advanced workers from the Labour Party at a time when it was sounding very socialist back in the early 1920s. This is not at all relevant in the present context, either in Britain or in Australia, although it was perhaps relevant under Jeremy Corbyn. In the case of the ALP, the only people who think it is on the radical left are those on the political right. Now, of course, they don't vote for that very reason. On domestic issues, the left is mainly different from the ALP by being more militant and reformist than the ALP, demanding more government funding for this and that, bemoaning the ALP's shift to a less interventionist economic policy. It criticises the ALP for betraying its own reformism. The left becomes what it wants the ALP to be. On international issues, the left has differed far more from the ALP, for good or ill, often expressing solidarity with all sorts of strange people. Labour to power with socialist policies is a slogan by recall. I don't know if anyone still uses it. If it is, I think it causes confusion. If by socialism we mean that what happens after the revolution, then nothing you do under capitalism can be socialist. It also seems to suggest that socialism could be achieved without a revolution. It seizes power from the bourgeoisie. Now let's look at the Whitlam era, which is a special place in left mythology. People like to describe the sacking of Whitlam on November 11, 1975 by the Governor-General as a coup. At the time, I took that view and went along with all the conspiracy theories. However, I was later persuaded that this was pretty much a load of nonsense. You had a government came across as incompetent, was going through an economic rough patch, and of course was blamed for this. In fact, I don't think any Western government that went to the polls in 1975 managed to survive. The coalition blocked supplying the Senate to force a general election. This was against convention, but not illegal. Whitlam refused to let the people decide by calling a general election, so John Kerr had to step in and do it for him. The coalition then went on to win the biggest landslide ever. End of story. The changes from the Whitlam years were generally not undone. If you look at areas like healthcare, education, Indigenous affairs, multiculturalism, art and culture, I'm not saying that everything was wonderful, but they're generally not worse. The big exception was tertiary education, but that was eliminated, free tertiary education, but that was eliminated by the Labor government of Pearl Keating. The Whitlam government was also quick off the mark in recognising China. Unlike the coalition, they were not left flat-footed when the Americans changed their China policy. Whitlam visited China while still in opposition and prior to Henry Kissinger. The ALP had adopted a policy of recognition back in 1955, and they established diplomatic relations within 3 weeks of coming into office. The ALP, of course, was not perturbed by the counter-revolution in China after Mao's death. This was shared by most of the left, including most so-called Maoists. In fact, you still have people who refuse to recognise the fact that the regime is totally nasty and reactionary and needs to be overthrown by a democratic revolution, just like all the other tyrannies in the world, such as those in Egypt, Iran, Cuba, etc. I think that the fact that the ALP now is no more reformist and no less conservative than the coalition creates an opportunity for the left to become the party of reform. However, for this to occur, it would have to be far more grounded than it is. Policies would have to be based on thorough investigation of the facts and really get into specific detail. They would also have to stand the test of scrutiny. What I'm saying is that you have to go way beyond the knowledge needed when all you are doing is expressing outrage or engaging in virtue signalling. Policies would not be vague sentences in a leaflet that you hand out at election time. They would be things you are constantly discussing out there in the community and developing. By developing our abilities to put up policies to solve problems in the here and now, we would also be in the process of preparing ourselves to run a revolutionary government. I also think we should have a special interest in reforms that serve the aims of the revolution. These are ones that provide a better starting point for transforming society after the revolution. One of these that particularly strikes me is in the area of education. At the moment, about 20% of the people live in the school system have learned virtually nothing. This is a problem because after the revolution, you don't want to find yourself with a large section of the proletariat who are at a low cultural and educational level. It would cause lots of extra difficulties. This is also an important area for closing the gap between Indigenous people and the rest of society. Continuing to sort out relations with the sexes is another important area. It is critical if you're trying to create a new society based on mutual regard rather than exploitation. In this area, I was struck by a particularly detailed proposal for paternity leave coming from the Grattan Institute. This could significantly increase the role of fathers in childbearing. The Grattan Institute is a politically centrist think tank in Melbourne, and I reckon they could be a bit of a role model for the left when it comes to the work they put into their policy proposals. I'm not suggesting that you should always agree with them, but I certainly recommend that you have a look at their stuff. They bring out reports and then publicise them through press releases, seminars and podcasts. Recently they've done a lot of work on net zero by 2050, and I think it's worth a look. Thank you.
Lastly, Kevin, Right, thanks. Well, thanks for having us here today. I joined the ALP at an interesting period, because it was that period during the split, of course, when the ALP in Victoria was genuinely left-wing in many policies. And as a young communist at the time, and it was just to show the the way the period operated and sort of pressures on people at that time. In my matriculation year at a Catholic college here in Melbourne, we had in the first period every Friday a full-time worker from the National Civic Council who used to be school captain come and lecture us on so-called Christian doctrine. And every week he'd come in and put up his map, pull it down, and there were red arrows zooming down from China, coming to us. And regularly I'd ask him what year they're going to get here, and he said 1964 every time. And I think we all know he was slightly out of that, although if Peter Dutton gets his way, it won't be long. At home I had parents who absolutely loathed the DLP and the anti-communists with a passion, and an uncle, my mother's brother, who worked as Assistant Secretary of the ARU with J.J. Brown, the Communist Secretary. I rather think my uncle was in both parties, but that's another point. So there were all those pressures, but I joined the ALP because at that time it was developing very good policies, but it was in that in-between period, and we had such things as from the very outset we opposed the Vietnam War, when Whitlam was in fact saying it was wrong to oppose it because that would cost you votes, so that's all that matters, of course, the votes. And indeed, in Mary Elizabeth Caldwell's biography of her father, which is much more a hagiography, but nonetheless, she points out that Whitlam undermined Caldwell in '66 when he ran the dirty unwinnable war election. And she's quite accurate on that one. And so I think it's ironic also, of course, that by '72, when Whitlam won, one of the main factors that got him there was the anti-war movement. Somewhere on the line, of course, he saw where the writing was on the wall and changed his mind, and off he went. But that was, and indeed there are other policies that people probably aren't aware of. For instance, at the '69 ALP conference, Judy Bornstein moved a motion for abortion on demand, and unless it's been rescinded since, it's still ALP policy officially, I would assume. Those sort of things were going around in the ALP at the time, and it was quite refreshing. And of course, the reason for it was because of the split. The Victorian ALP was very heavily influenced by the left unions who were left in Victoria, and they played a key role. They chose the executive. I was elected to the executive a couple of times. Don't laugh when I tell you this, you cannot laugh, but don't laugh, as the youth representative at the time. Well, there you are. That's right. And there were certainly Stalinist elements about the way it was done, but nonetheless, the policies that came out were excellent. For instance, the 69 or 70 conference, just after John Zaar became the first draft resistor jailed in here, it was in Pentridge, we took the conference to Pentridge and protested outside Pentridge about it. And we did it tactically. We thought up the idea, and I was going to move it, and we thought, no, being a young bloke, they might knock us back. So we got Arthur Corwell to move the motion, which I seconded, and then Bill Hartley as secretary organised buses, and we went to Pentridge and met as a conference outside Pentridge to protest about the jailing of John Zaar. But looking back on it, at the time I thought that was real ALP. We used to laugh at New South Wales. We'd call the left in New South Wales Her Most Gracious Majesty's left, and we thought, but in retrospect, of course, being a naive young man as I was then, obviously, New South Wales was the real ALP. Verity made the point that in 1900, people left it because all they thought about was getting people into Parliament. And in fact, then it's for 120 years it hasn't changed. But what was happening in Victoria was clearly an aberration. It was simply the fact that in '55, the right wing hived off. It wasn't there. In New South Wales, the right wing unions were still there controlling the show. In Victoria, they weren't. And for that brief period, up until the Coburg Town Hall, when they came back, the four unions came back into the ALP. For that period, the ALP was very much a left-wing party in Victoria because of union control. And the unions at that time, while I would suggest that ALP never has been nor never will be a Marxist party, many of the unionists and many of the people in the party at that time were Marxists, and it used to put working class people into Parliament, for God's sake. I mean, these days you'd be racking your brain to think of one, I would think, who's genuine working class. And the point that I think Verity made, that just after that period, we saw, of course, the influx of people who didn't come out of unions but going into those sort of positions. The Hawks, the Creans, people like Ralph Willis, all those people that came straight from education into positions in the union and labour movement, and that was part of the whole decline, I think, of the ALP and the left ALP ever was, but certainly in Victoria as well, being essentially left. I mean, it just simply wasn't. But then, of course, we had federal intervention, and the excuses for that were mostly made up. The one about, particularly about, I might tell the story later if people want to, but we were accused of having sold holding down the Girdler that year in 1970 on state aid, when in fact, which was state policy at the time, but in fact he sold us down the Girdler, but the press had the absolute opposite of the way it told the story. But anyway, the federal intervention, of course, was led by the Federal Party to get rid of this terrible left-wing branch. But nonetheless, after federal intervention, when we formed the Socialist Left, the old executive split about half and half into those who joined the Socialist Left and those who became part of the right faction. And then there were people in the middle like Jim Cairns who had no faction, whatever. So it wasn't even that left wing as such, it was very much half and half. But it was formed, but I'm going to say now that when federal intervention occurred in September 1970, the next night 5 of us got together at Bob Hogg's place, which included my uncle Bill, the aforementioned, who was also on the executive at federal intervention, George Crawford, Bill Hartley and me. I think that was it, I think that was the 5. And we formed what was become the Socialist Left. We called a meeting the following week at your union office, in fact, Max, of the left union leaders, and once they got together, we then formed it. Now this was quite exciting because Max talked about being disillusioned when he came in, and by that time I can fully understand why he was disillusioned when he came in. But also, he also mentioned about the exciting democracy in the Communist Party in those years before you folded up. And it was the same in the Socialist Left. The original Socialist Left met en masse once a month at a hall in North Melbourne and formed policy and talked. And indeed, I joined the ALP not because I wanted to see it win Parliament. I think you're right. I mean, we'd rather see it win government than the other lot. But nonetheless, my purpose for joining was I saw it as a better spot than the Communist Party to instigate debate around issues in society. And we discussed all that at these meetings. When people would actually bring lunch, we'd have an all-day session, and it was totally democratic. And for some period, it was a very exciting place to be and to work. And Bob Hogg and I were, and I think, people know Bob Hogg. I think Carl went to his head eventually. But the last time we spoke, he said, do you think I've sold out? And I said, yes, and that's the last time we spoke. But we were co-editing. We brought out a news sheet originally, and then for a couple of years, we co-edited the weekly newspaper, which was interesting at the time because I was editing in the Murdoch Empire, and I was also editing the Socialist Left newspaper at the same time, which was all very interesting. And the paper we brought out, pushed the political issues. It was a quite exciting time to be operating. But then, once they came to meetings and said, "Look, we've talked to Holding, we've talked to these people," then it started to decline. Once they said, "Let's have an executive that can meet between meetings," it started to decline, because it became bureaucratic and began to get back into the mainstream ALP, which after the 4 unions came back, of course, was now slipping back into being the real ALP like every other state in the country. And so it went downhill from there, but it did have, for a period, there was a very exciting period of real democracy in the Socialist Left. By the time Max joined, it had reached the stage where they were people were joining just to put bums on seats, because one of the things that was so important to it in those first couple of years was that we couldn't get anyone into Parliament because of the voting system. The right always had enough votes to win. So only in the Senate, where there was a PR voting system, could we get one senator every term. And I argued that was a great idea. We had someone in Parliament to put these ideas, but no one wanted to join us to get into Parliament. But once they started opening up and doing deals with other factions to get people's bums on seats, people started joining the Socialist left just to get into Parliament. And that didn't help it at all. And by the time, well, after the four unions came back, and indeed on the four unions one as well, because we were sort of the left, we became a left of the left as this was happening. And we'd get a socialist left meetings, we'd get rolled every time, but because we'd go along, okay, we'd go along with the majority vote and agree. But the one vote we won on, there was a meeting at Collingwood Town Hall the week before the conference at Coburg that brought the four unions back. And at the Collingwood meeting, everyone brought in as many people as we could. It wasn't stacking as such, but you got everyone you could get into the place. So the place was bulging at this stage. And we won by a very narrow majority. We won that we would vote not to let them in. And indeed, the people who lost didn't exactly vote against that. But the way they did it was certain key unions simply abstained from voting, which by default let them in. So there was a sense of, if you want to use the term, ratting, I think, going on there. That was virtually the end for me in the Socialist Left, really. That time I was an endorsed councillor at Fitzroy Council, so I hung in until, I think I resigned from council in 85, so I think I hung in then and just drifted away from it. But there was in the ALP in that period, a quite exciting time when it was genuinely left, not Marxist left, but there were a lot of people in it who would call themselves Marxists, but there was a left tendency there which was pretty important. As for the people talking about where we are now, well, the ALP is a totally lost cause in my opinion, so let's forget that. But I could see, I don't know, Verity probably deals with a different cross-section of young people, but being at 3CR, and I've been doing things at 3CR for 40 years, I've seen heaps of young people come through. I've got 2 young people working with me on a program at the moment. And they are so encouraging, in my opinion. The important thing is none of them want to join a political party. They didn't join a political party in a fit. And there probably is not one much worth joining anyway. But they're incredibly active around political issues, either industrial ones, but certainly issues like climate change at the moment and those sorts of issues. There's young people who are incredibly involved and they come and go very much. And I presume when they go, I hope when they go, they keep going on and doing things in society somehow. But I see great hope in that, and I'm seeing hope at the moment, of course, in the youth movement around the world in terms of this. Apart from Greta Thunberg, there's a young woman from Uganda I've heard speak a couple of times recently on climate change issues. It's absolutely brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And I think there's real hope there that young people, political parties mightn't be the answer, but there are young people who are able to raise these issues. And of course, in the end, whatever we do, we've got to challenge capitalism. I mean, it's the enemy, it's what we have to get rid of. And we hope that all that leads to us at some stage, these young people putting so much pressure on capitalism that it has to move. I mean, back in 60, in that early period, I joined the ALP, there was things happening. The Vietnam War was critical to us in many ways in terms of our development politically, but also 68, we all thought the revolution was coming next week. And I think people would agree, like the Chinese in 64, we were just slightly out in that one. But nonetheless, those things can happen. It can happen again, and young people led it then. And there are real signs, I think, the way the world's going, and particularly at a stage when literally the world can't survive unless they do something about the problem, that young people could start leading another revolution that could hopefully change things in the future. We oldies are just going to drift away, I guess, eventually. That's it. Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, before we go to responses, I just wanted to centre the questions. Everyone gave very thoughtful opening statements. just to reiterate some of the words of the prompt, just to get that thought pattern happening again. So you all talked about your interactions with the ALP in various times, and also your backgrounds in socialism relating to that. How would we as socialists understand that long trajectory of the ALP over the 20th century, and has the left participated in the direction of the ALP, but also what does that say for the left's relationship to the ALP today? We've sort of been touching on that, but I just thought I'd recenter on that before we hand back to Verity for responses.
Thank Max and David and Kevin for being so thought-provoking. Just pick up on a few points from each to throw back at you and ask questions. Max, you described how the Communist Party was the first party to condemn the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and in general, do you think it's possible that the CPA's de-Stalinisation, particularly with the Maoists leading in the early 60s and from this far in the 1970s, do you think that process actually also in a way provided the key to the CPA's increasing softness on labour? That there's a correlation there between its de-Stalinisation and its the way that it worked to help the Hawke government institute the Accord. Was there a lack of analysis around the implications of the Accord longer term for the workforce? Was there awareness that, in a way, that the CP union officials like Carmichael and so on were really presiding over a system that led to a much more segmented labour market that was fine for the best paid workers at the top, enterprise bargaining, helps metal workers, people like that, but that the move away from centralised wage fixing was a disaster for people at the bottom of the labour market, and that it did help usher in that the labour market that we have now that is highly casualised, and where the discrepancies between the pay of those at the top and the pay of those at the bottom has totally ballooned out in a way that we've never seen historically. And obviously that really suited corporations to have that highly segmented, layered labour market. David, I loved your description of the ironies of the way we bag the Labor Party endlessly and then are so relieved when they win. Of course it's true. And it's that sort of the lesser evil argument that has so dominated the relations between the left and the Labor Party for 130 years. So I'd like to throw out the question of to what extent compulsory voting feeds into this, because it's quite a distinctive feature of Australian democracy, of compulsory voting. Now, on balance, I'm in favour of compulsory voting. When you see what happens in places like the United States, you have to be glad that it's there. But it does change the dynamic that Labor, in the final analysis, knows that people like us will give it our preferences, whatever we might do with our first preferences. And so really they don't need to keep the left happy, they don't need to inspire people to come out to vote in the first instance, which has been the success of Corbynism, that it was able to actually use the non-compulsory voting system in Britain to bring in a new breed of inspired Labor activists that completely regenerated the party for a while, because there wasn't compulsory voting, so those people are valuable. David, I think you also said, I might have misheard about blue-collar workers being as likely to vote for the coalition as Labor. I think, I might have misheard you, but I think it's important that we don't fall into the trap that Morrison always likes to put out, that self-employed plumbers and electricians are working class. They're not. Whereas the plumber and electrician that work for an employer on a building site are working class. So you've got to cut through the difference between a manual occupation and being working class. The vast majority of the working class nowadays are probably nurses and teachers and lower paid office workers. A lot of blue-collar workers are still working class, but increasingly, particularly with more sort of private contracting work, a lot of them are, their relationship to the means of production is different from what it used to be, and that's why they're more likely to vote coalition than their forebears 20, 30, 40 years ago, who were employed by an employer and who did see themselves as working class and were in fact working class.
Yeah, I shouldn't have said blue collar, I should have just said the working class perhaps. And then we incorporate those nurses and teachers and people like that.
Well, no, yeah, I know, but that's where the Labor vote is possibly growing. Yeah, or certainly.
Well, just on that, the figures are very clear. I read some research recently. In the last 40 years, there's been a decline amongst working class in the broader sense from a solid 45% of the Labor Party vote, and the tertiary educated provide about 20% of the Labor 40 years ago. Now it's about the reverse. Now it's only about 20% amongst workers and over 40% amongst tertiary educated.
But a lot of workers now have a tertiary education.
Well, yeah, I mean,
So
but they're still increasingly voting. They compare with those without that education.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is about, 80% of the population are working class, and the vote is 50% of coalition and Labor. So,
I think it's about 70%, 67% working class rather than.
But also, unfortunately, many working class people don't consider themselves working class anymore, which is another problem.
yeah.
And that's that's one that needs to be addressed.
And that's partly Labor's fault for moving away from languages of class.
Yeah, of course,
Yes.
yes.
That becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Can I just ask on that, is that just Labor's fault, or has the socialist left also moved to a more, say, a sociological version of class?
Socialism, maybe you mean the left in Australia generally, or in the ALP?
Both.
Well, because the ALP, I don't think the socialist left is remotely socialist anymore. I mean, that's ridiculous. It stopped being socialist, but shortly after the four unions came back, I think. As a good example of that, in fact, when Andrews became opposition leader, he was interviewed by The Age, and they pointed out he was in the socialist left faction, but he made clear 3 times in the interview, he made clear he was definitely not a socialist. Shades of Jesus Christ or Shakespeare, and twice did he refuse.
And finally, Kevin, your description of the Victorian Party and how it was more to the left because of the split, that raised the question of, is the New South Wales Party completely beyond redemption? I mean, it's just been amazing that, right from 1891, 1892, the New South Wales right becomes a problem for the Australian left and remains a problem. And of course, you raised the very important issue of the increasing professionalisation of Labor MPs. The most common occupational background of a Labor MP since 2001 has been staff to a Labor MP. And this is just, disastrous for Labor Party.
Well, I think the state of New South Wales, if you look at someone who's considered one of the left figures in New South Wales politics, you take a Jack Lang, for instance. Now,
a left social fascist.
Left social fascist, exactly. He wrote 2 volumes to explain what a wonderful job he did for the economy. But apart from his hatred for the bankers was only exceeded in the book by his absolute hatred for communism and communists. So he was the left figure, and it's a bit hard to say that a left figure who hates communism could be called Marxist or anything else. Yeah.
Thanks, Verity. Max, do you want to have some?
Oh, God, there's a whole lot there. Look, first of all, the point about supporting supporting the reforms Czechoslovakia, opposing the Warsaw Pact invasion. I mean, that was a logical development of our thinking that had begun. If you recall, I mean, during that anti-Vietnam War, there was all the upheaval and discussion going all around the world. It was a very exciting period, and particularly as one who had been, on the shop floor and been through strikes and so on, and was very interested in the whole idea of worker control and worker power. There was so much to read, you couldn't keep up with it all. So many ideas going on. So that was all contributing to the thinking within the party about, in particular, how making democracy much more central to what we're about. democracy at all levels, democracy of ownership, democracy of control, and so on. And of course, that was happening in this terrific discussion going on, and in the middle of that, the Czechs were actually trying to do it in practice. And so the two things just came together. So it was an integral part of our overall strategic thinking, which was emerging, and certainly hadn't been got far by then. But I remember at the 1970 first conference of the Metal Workers Union, I worked with Laurie Carmichael to develop what was probably the first policy statement on worker intervention, and we called it worker intervention. Was in management prerogatives, in fact it went through. It was quite a discussion because some were wondering if it wasn't too radical to be talking about that. Subsequently, just at the Accord, look, we could go on for hours about the Accord. I'll just only mention a couple of things. Well, I was a strong supporter of it once I understood and had a discussion with a lot of people that it had enormous potential. My criticism, one of my criticisms of the Accord period was that the unions did not take advantage, anything like what they could have done out of the Accord, due to conservative leadership and so on. Because one of the things the Accord did was free us from absolute total focus on wage increases. In the metal workers, we were brilliant at all this over-reward stuff, but everything else got missed. Every day was, in fact, some days we went through a period when some workplaces, our organisers would go out not once a year, twice a year to get another wage increase. And I used to say, well, that's all very well, but what are you doing about occupational health and safety? What are you doing about the workers having a say, etc., etc.? But there was just, and that led, and I can remember railing against this once at a state council meeting. That began the whole system of where the powerful workers were getting all the attention, and people like on the rigs, for example, their wages were going up. I remember we had a 2-hour meeting one night, and it was all about the workers on the rigs were on strike, and it was about whether they'd accept $34,000 a year or $36,000, when the women in the auto component sector were on barely over a war. They were on about 11 or 12,000. And I hit the roof saying we never spend 2 hours discussing the lower pay, and the women in particular. So all the attention was happening there. The Accord, the first few years of the Accord were very important in that regard, because centralised wage fixing always works better for the lower paid. So the lower paid did quite well in that first 6 or 7 years. Women in particular, the highest we've ever got as a proportion of the male wage was in those first years of the Accord because of centralised wage fixing. What was missing, what we used to do in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, was the campaign outside the Commission. But still, a lot of good stuff was won in that period. Where it then started, as I said, we were able to do a lot of exciting things actually with the Accord. And I mean, I was at the ACTU then and able to, the way we were able to get all the food unions working together and really driving a radical agenda of the unions developing their own strategy for the industry, which included, a say in the workplace and so on, intervening into management. And it was what was interesting about that experience of the 9 unions, about 3 or 4 of them were left-wing, but 3 or 4 of them were out of the right, including a couple led by old NCC people. But because we focused on really particular things, we got them united, working together. And it took a while. The first couple of years, the left and right would fight one another. But after a while, once we got focused on real issues, and it was interesting that even a couple of those officials who were close to Santa Maria, they became interested in the whole idea of workers intervening into management, which is some of the things we were negotiating as part of the enterprise bargaining. Big mistake then was enterprise bargaining without the facility to bargain across the industry. The background to it is this, that Bill Kelty, with actually the best of intentions, he was very keen, and I think this element of it was correct, very keen to have more rank and file involvement. And of course, the Court up to that time, because so much was done through the Commission, there wasn't a big role for the shop stewards. And Bill was very keen to change all that. He wanted more involvement. The problem was doing it enterprise bargaining then without ability to negotiate across the industry means we fragmented the whole thing, and then that meant that those with the power could then get a big wage, and those without couldn't. And I actually argued that with him. It's a tragedy. Actually, Carmichael had just retired or taken on another job, left the ACTU. If he had still been around, I'm sure it wouldn't have got through in the way it did. But and that was where it all started to go pear-shaped. And just finally, I mean, we've now got people in the underground metro on 300 grand a year, for Christ's sake, tradespeople. Now, I never went to the union movement to get people that kind of money, whereas and it's just money militancy now. It's got nothing to do with politics or any intervention or anything like that. And the poor old bloody lower paid are left. I mean, some unions are trying hard, and it's just been a disaster, that element of it.
That leads also to another problem, I think, which really occurred in the union movements at the time. I think the Accord, Max might disagree with this, had a bit to do with the decline of the union movement in recent years. But the other factor was that unions used to educate members. Particularly when they had large memberships and most people were in the union, they got educated politically, which just doesn't happen much anymore. Like your union, you mentioned being an education officer, had local branches. I remember speaking at a local branch at Moorabbin to your union's local branch out there. Paddy Garrity, who revived this building years ago, when he was a seaman, he talked about how he got his political education through the books, through the libraries that the unions put on the ships. Now, those things don't happen anymore, and that's, so workers aren't getting educated in the sort of politics we think they should be educated in, which is part of the problem.
Dave, would you like to do some response?
I just think that the key thing about the relationship between the left and the ALP ultimately is the question of how do you mix reformism and revolution? Because people on the extreme left, like myself, are inspired by the idea of getting rid of the existing social order, and there is some sort of notion that that's going to be a major rupture. And we have a problem in figuring out how to relate that to the day-to-day business of reform and engaging with people in their day-to-day activities and making the system better than it is, or preparing within the system for the future. And I don't think we succeeded very well in that, and I'm just wondering what other people think. But depending on the politics, we still believe in revolution, but how being radical, making that big, how do you use the struggles of the day-to-day, the reformist struggles to move on?
If I could just make one brief point.
Please.
There's this myth that the Accord led to the dropping membership of unions. In fact, the research shows by David, what's his name? Who did a great study, and then there's been 2 or 3 other studies, but his was David Beats. He did a great study to show that in fact the decline had started already, and that for the period of the Accord, actually it didn't get any worse for that period. It then started to get worse after that. And there's been a couple of studies along those lines.
What about amalgamations?
Oh, don't talk to me about that.
I mean, they didn't help union.
Well, the big problem was that the unions didn't amalgamate except they did in the white collar area, teachers, nurses and so on, and they've been the most successful. The blue collar unions amalgamated along political lines rather than industry lines, and that was a huge mistake. You had left-wing unions, instead of joining with the industry, they'd all come together, same with the right-wing unions, and it's been a bloody disaster in the blue collar field.
Were you done, David? No. You've got more time. You've got another few minutes.
Sorry, who were your name again?
Ryan and Max and Kevin.
No. I just want to ask you about Czechoslovakia. I was abhorred by the Soviet invasion, but I'm just wondering whether if the Russians had left Czechoslovakia alone, would it have, I suspect it would have just become a social democrat variety of capitalism. It would have just merged with the West. I just don't think there was a real much of a revolution in that. But anyway,
Thanks.
I think it would have been a much more democratic, the most advanced democratic socialist society the way it was going. And the other very good thing they were doing was the way they were going about it. It wasn't coming from the top, it was really mobilising people from the bottom in the workplaces and so on. And I think it would have been, for example, if it had been allowed to flower over the next 10 years, it would have been something much more attractive even than the Nordic countries.
I just don't think there was a revolutionary movement in Czechoslovakia. It would have just become a social democrat.
No, I think it would have been more advanced than that, yeah. Because the process they were going about was so good, so involving and democratic.
But also in cases where the left can have to support groups that may not be left anyway. I mean, who knows what a Palestine would look like if they get independence of some sort. Will it be a left government? It may not be. It may be an Islamic government. But we still have to support them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Rhodesia was the same. We supported Mugabe, and at the time it was the correct thing to do. Now, he was a good example of power corrupting in the end, but nonetheless, there's those sort of causes you have to support. But they don't necessarily have to be.
Yeah, I definitely supported Ducek, but I didn't think that he was.
I think that's a different example, really, because they could have been left in the end anyway.
I don't think that they would have led to some great new flowering subject.
Kevin, do you have some responses you want to say?
Oh, not really. I think it's all been responded to as we discussed. The other thing is Max talked about the, he wouldn't mind eradicating the Fair Work Commission, and sadly, I mean, Rudd got elected on two issues. The massive union campaign, we all went to the MCD and all those rallies around tearing up work choices was the slogan, and also climate change, and he failed miserably on both. You know, he tore about 2 pages out of work choices. In fact, on my satire piece on 3CR, I call it Fair Work, True the Aussie, no longer work choices, just looks like it. That's the tragedy of it, yeah.
And see, part of the reason that, it was tough negotiating, right? And Julia Gillard played a bloody tough role, I might add, as the minister. It's often forgotten. And but part of the problem was that the unions didn't have a bigger vision about what they wanted. Now, I've been talking and writing some stuff recently about what we need is a totally different kind of legislation. We want what I call facilitative legislation that sets out a whole lot of rights and principles, but what's the word, quite pointing at specific things, so that the unions have a whole lot of rights to undertake things, but it's not sort of laid down in black and white, to give it some more freedom, and then they can, to help encourage collective bargaining right across the board, at the national level, industry-wide and so on. And then they've got to start doing that now and break the law as a way of starting to achieve it. So just fiddling with a few bits and pieces of the legislation around the edges is not what we want. It's got to be much more substantial.
Does anyone have any more responses before we put to audience questions? Okay, if anyone in the audience has a question, put your hand up and maybe just stand up and ask the question. We have one or two from Zoom as well, so anyone have a question? Jack, go ahead.
Awesome. I suppose I would ask the rest of the panel, apart from Max, they just wanted to proffer any thoughts about the Accords, the experience of it as a project, what the ramifications have been for not just the Labor Party but also the union movement, organised working class into today.
Anyone? Take.
Well, I think I've already intimated what I thought of the Accord. It was
I think it was part of the decline of the union movement. I think any deal that includes keeping wages suppressed is not good for working people. No matter what the other side of it is, in terms of what the benefits they get, which are
And it was also insidious as an example of a social contract between the union movement and a government, which no from a sort of a socialist perspective. Trotskyist traditions was very influenced by the experience in Britain in the 1970s, which is why the IS tendency here was so vehement and critical of the Accord and what it was going to do to Labor and the left, Labor in a broader sense.
And how did those debates play out between the IS and was that with the CPA at the time? Were they?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is just one of the sort of the IS, this is Socialist Action, one of the successor organisations, just absolutely ballistic that the Communist Party could have been involved in treating with the AC, with the Communist Union leaders, negotiating with Hawke and Hayden behind the backs of workers prior to the election of the government in 1983 and then collaborating with them for the following decade and so to basically sell out the workers and create a labour market in Australia that is much more better at increasing profits for corporations than improving wages and conditions for workers.
Yeah, I think it's summed up by the fact that the capitalists now repeatedly say they'd love Labor to get back to the good days of the Hawke-Keating government.
But see, we didn't do that. As soon as, of course, the Accord came on fairly, but we immediately had it published widely. All our shop stewards courses, it was widely discussed, and we looked at all the possibilities because there was a lot, as I said before. One of my big criticisms of the union movement didn't take advantage of a lot of the things we were able to do. And we very were conscious about making it the ownership by the members. It certainly wasn't done on the basis of keeping it from them. Every course we ran, we had it discussed and the things they could do on the job. But the Accord didn't stop them doing heaps of things in the workplace. There was no ban on any negotiation about anything. And there wasn't any ban on wage increase, except we were doing it at the central level. It was nothing like that. What was the prices and income stuff in Britain was nothing like that at all. But we didn't use it enough.
You said that the unions didn't take advantage of the Accord. What was the Communist Party's advice or position to the unions in that? Were they suggesting to them?
Yeah, we were trying to get people, but the problem was, it's typical of the unions for a long that Marx talked about way back. They were so, and this is particularly true of the Anglo-Celtic culture, they were so focused all the time on wage increases, money militancy, that to get them to think of other wider issues that workers were interested in my experience of dozens and dozens of shop stewards courses, you got them talking about their work, for example, and how every time you'd explain, you do a session on surplus value and capitalism and the division of labour and what that did to work. And every time you'd get a wonderful discussion. People would suddenly say, oh shit. And then they'd talk about how they were so alienated. Well, they wouldn't use those words, but their management never listened to them. My management's rat shit. And they knew how to fix everything. That kind of stuff. There was nothing stopping us doing a lot more about that. And then beginning with stuff like intervening in the new technology, putting bans on it like we did, for example, at the three big aircraft companies, bringing in new technology. We said, no, it's not coming in until we spend 6 weeks, shop steward seminar to plan how we're going to negotiate. And that was just before the Accord, but we'd do the same thing under the Accord. It didn't stop you doing any of that. And we negotiated the best agreement ever on new technology because of doing it that way. On the basis they couldn't get it in unless they sat down and talked with us after we'd worked out what we wanted. New work systems, new skills, all that kind of stuff. But the whole culture of most of the movement is not like that. They couldn't think outside getting a wage increase.
So do you think that was particular to that moment in history? Was it just in the 80s, or was that a build-up of...
That's been a general problem of the union movement forever. I mean, getting beyond wage increases, that's what most organisers sort of came up on and all they think about. Those of us who come out of the CP we were trying to instill that kind of stuff, you know. Challenge the boss's bloody prerogatives.
Duncan, another question? Do you want to maybe stand up?
Sure. My understanding is that a lot of the CPA sort of support for the Accord was that it was a move towards a planned economy, was the idea, and that it would get workers through their representatives like a seat at the table. I understand that as being like a way that it was sold at the time, but do you think ultimately now with like more recent sort of discussion around a topic like Elizabeth Humphrey's book, that perhaps it wasn't positive overall, or that it just wasn't taken advantage of? Is that your sort of position? Like,
it's a bit of both. But see, take the industry plans were developed on the button, and 2 or 3 of them actually the unions initiated. We initiated the one in the food industry, and it wasn't done just at the top. I ran a seminar during the discussion about the steel industry plan for 100 shop stewards at Clyde Cameron College. We said to Button, we're not finishing this until the shop stewards, and we were there for about 4 days. The discussion was fantastic. And they worked in groups, and we then made a big input to what eventually came out as the steel plan, which gave the unions quite a big say then in the industry. And we did the same with the food industry. I ran a seminar for 65 shop stewards and officials when we developed the food industry plan. Then went back to Button and Crean with it. So, and there was the other plans. There was the textile plan. There was a chemical industry plan. There was a heavy engineering. I did a lot of work on that as well. And we didn't just do it at the top. In fact, we made sure, and Button and Crean, Button especially, was very keen on the idea that we were first of all starting with the shop stewards and getting them to think and have an input. He thought that was terrific. So a lot of that, then in a couple of those things, then the other unions didn't do that, you know. They just did everything at the top. So yeah, it did have an element of us intervening in the industry plans. And we did, for that period, quite successfully. I mean, the food industry plan was bloody terrific. It got us a lot of control in the workplace. The stewards were going to have much bigger say. It was going to be training for English language, which was a big problem. Committees set up jointly to do all of that. But of course, come the Howard years, that was ended just like that.
Any responses to that, or we'll take another question? Yes, please.
I was just wondering about the Button plan. I didn't really remember the Button car plan, which was to lower the tariffs on imported cars, which is essentially to stuff our car industry, which they just recently succeeded in doing. But,
that's not true.
Well, I believe it's true.
It's not true.
They didn't. Anyway, I was just wondering if it was merely including the workers in discussions. So they say, as in my case, I work at the post office, and I'm a postie and a union rep, and I'm the president of the CW in Victoria. And what I see is the posties being involved in this most magnificent talk fest, and then they just do it to us. There's no trickery. They just, well, there is. They talk about the inflation rate. The Australian Post says 1.8% funny. I thought it was 3.4 or 3.6 or something. You know, they talk to you, and that's it. And you're steamrolled, because whatever they say bamboozles most of the people there, because we're bloody posties, or in that instance they're car workers, or in that instance, you know, there are other people about to be reformed out of their jobs. That's how I feel.
It didn't work like that. So the auto, there was a very conscious involvement of the shop stewards. Because our union had a lot of members, we weren't joined with the Aviva at the time, but that was coming up. And we made sure there was those kind of, in South Australia here, considerable involvement of the shop stewards' input into the auto plan. Now, what happened with the auto plan was very good. The plan was, as the unions agreed, and I certainly supported, that we bring down tariffs while we rationalise a lot of the quite stupidity that was in the auto industry, like, you know, huge number of components that you could then bring down to 3 or 4 and use in all the cars. the quality of the vehicles improved immensely. We came from one of the worst quality to among the highest. And then we were exporting cars then, made up vehicles, which we weren't doing before. In Toyota, holders were exporting built up cars into the Middle East and so on. That had never happened before.
Well, they had in the 60s. They were exporting to South Africa and New Zealand and other places.
But it hadn't for many years. And under the Button plan, that's what was happening. And it was actually going very well. But who killed the car industry? It happened when they withdrew the 300 million, which was every country who has a car industry subsidises it.
No,
without and here we had the 300 million was piddling compared with all the others, absolutely piddling. And so when they withdrew that was the cause of the demise of the car industry. Up to then it was going very well, and the wages were going well, and there'd been a whole turnaround in both Ford, General Motors, but it had already happened in Toyota, where the workers were getting a much bigger say on how to build a car and so on, and vehicle in particular got much higher skills.
I understand that.
But it was the Abbott government that stopped the car industry.
Well, finally, but we were exporting.
The Button plan actually had nothing to do with it.
For police cars, like priests went over that sort of stuff. But nevertheless, it seemed to be the end result of the initial plans to reform, which was, to my mind, to get rid of any opposition to bringing cars in from overseas.
I mean, under Button plan, that simply did
cheap
not happen. It's absolute mythology. In fact, one of the problems, the car industry was going so well, and because it was so heavily unionised, 100% union, that's why they went after it. If it hadn't been unionised, Abbott never wouldn't have done anything about it. They went after it because of that reason. But the Button plan on that particular industry worked as well as anyone.
Okay, maybe I'll take a quick question online then before Johnny. Maybe we'll start with you, Verity. What policies would a mass-based left party have to actually restructure the economy to enable its other policies, given a global Great Depression combined with a global pandemic?
What?
So what policies would a mass-based left party have to actually restructure the economy, given the present pandemic and potential global depression?
Well, socialisation of all natural monopolies would be a start. Certainly in the context of the climate crisis, one of the whole problems has been privatisation of the energy sector.
Mm-hmm.
You can't expect private operators to even want to encourage people to reduce emissions.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very impressed by the work of an organisation called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which has been going for about the last 10 years. And they basically argue that the battle for socialism, for a better world, is now inextricably linked with the battle to save the planet. And that absolutely crucial role of the left is to promote greater public ownership, a reclaiming of the commons. Because that's really what we've seen in the last 3 to 4 decades under neoliberal globalisation, is this constant invading of the commons and the socialisation of losses and the privatisation of profits. And so I think that's sort of the starting point for a left program, is to reclaim public ownership. And you would start with the most obvious cases of the natural monopolies in the essential services. The obvious categories that we can think of.
Yeah, my problem with all that, I agree totally, that's what we want. But you got to come back in the current politics and where we work now, and much more reactionary politics. The big issue is the how. How do we do that? And that's, we can say, look, we want to bloody socialise this and socialise all of which I agree with. But what puzzles me all the time, and I think about all the time, is what are the steps we can make towards that? In the finish, we can have all these fucking big ideas. We want a socialist society, communist society, beautiful. But how do we do it? Not too many countries are doing it. What is the step we do next week that contributes to that, and it continues over the next few years. So we achieve that.
And what would be the role of Marxists and socialists in that
contributing
project?
to that. Contributing to that strategic thinking.
If we knew the answer, we'd do it tomorrow. But that's the point. I mean, I've been to so many conferences over the years where the subject matter has been some form of where does the left go from here, that we haven't yet found that solution, unfortunately, really, in this sort of society, where unfortunately, well, it's part of the Marxist principle, of course, that the hegemonic economic order controls your society, and it does, and that's the problem we face. We've got to get over that.
There are some opportunities there in that what's happened with the plundering of the commons is that it has brought together people that didn't used to see themselves as having interests in common. So workers in the privatised industries have interests in common with the consumers and the people out there in society who are getting such a bad deal from those privatised industries. And so there are more community alliances and examples of successful struggles for sort of, across class lines in a way, in defence of the public against privatisation.
There's been some interesting examples in America where some unions have worked with potential members, or own members, but potential members. For example, when they're privatising something, for the workers to take it into a cooperative ownership, with the unions helping them. Now that's a real concrete thing to do. A group of black women house carers, very poorly paid, up in northern New York with the SEIU, who's a very fine US union. When they were privatising it, helped them set up a co-op. They helped them learn how to run the co-ops, and every one of them joined the union. They went from about $7 an hour to about $15 an hour because they knew how to run the whole thing so much more efficiently, and the cost of actually running this particular carer system came down because they were running it completely. No bloody management. They run it as their own team. Now that's a really concrete way of tackling the issue. And there's been 2 or 3 others. Some Uber drivers, they've done the same. One of the unions got the Uber drivers to set up their own co-op and run much better systems than Uber itself. So that's the kind of thing we've got to be looking for all the time. Something that's a real concrete step.
Earthwork is doing it here, of course, with co-ops. They've got a cleaning part now as well, and they've got a number of co-ops. So they're having a go at that one. Yeah.
And just one thing, it's not just democratic ownership, it's got to be democratic management as well. A co-op that's not also democratically managed by its owners is not worth having, I don't think, because it's the same as any company.
Just, sorry, my name's Liam. Thanks very much for everyone's, it's been really, really fascinating.
You're going to stand up, Liam?
Yeah, I just want to point back to the question we got online. What politics would a mass-based left party have to have? It seems to me that there was a little bit of an elision of that. Like, is the ALP the mass-based left party, or does there need to be a mass-based left party? I wonder what the panelists think of that. Like, is there a party already? Does there need to be a party? Or is organisation going to happen in a different way?
I think he's being hypothetical, but he's certainly not referring to the left party.
But please save us from any more attempts to found a new left party.
Could you say more about it?
Oh, no, I just think that the future has to come from below. And not from people sitting around in a room like this deciding to, found a party with a perfect program that'll solve all the problems. Change doesn't happen like that. Change comes out of struggle, out of movement, out of unrest, out of chaos even. And discontent with what capitalists are doing to the planet is what will motivate the transition. And that struggle will throw up loose forms of organisation, hopefully they won't be durable ones that are going to lay down lessons for how you've got to behave, what contortions you've got to do, what slogans you've got to mount and so on. It's just awful that.
You disappoint me a bit there, Verity, because I've listened to my Prime Minister this week and he tells me that can-do capitalism the Australian way is going to save the planet. So, yeah, apparently not.
God's blessing.
But look, for 100 years or more, there's been attempts to form parties to replace the major party, whatever it is, the ALP, Social Democrats, etc. And certainly in developed capitalist countries, I'm not aware that one of those has ever succeeded. The Communist Party came into being with the idea of replacing the mass parties of Labour, and none of them succeeded. Maybe with, but it was a bit different in Italy. The party became a mass party, but then there wasn't a mass sort of social democratic party like we have experienced. So after 100 years, we've got plenty of lessons to know how that it hasn't worked. Having said that, you've got to deal with what's there. So because it's pretty, it's pretty permanent at the moment. So you've got to build movements around it, and particularly thinking and strategically, and then finding ways to get it, not just in the political party, not just in the Labor, but elsewhere as well. It's interesting, all these independents that are emerging in almost every electorate, and some of them are very fine with people, very fine objectives. That's going to be a new phenomenon. And they're working together all around the country. I read how they're all connecting. Now, they're focusing on climate change, and that's going to be terrific. But what comes out of all that will be really interesting.
Well, wait and see on that, because they're very good on the issues they're very good on, but none of them, to my knowledge, have any real knowledge of class struggle.
No.
In a real sense. So they're good, but they're not going to change things too much in capitalism.
So what does that mean for socialists today? If there is no class struggle or consciousness of class, how do socialists act? How do they think and act about the present?
It's a good question, isn't it? You've got to. I think unions are key to it, and unfortunately, unions are quite weak at the moment. But you've got to get workers aware that they're involved in a class struggle, and I think it's been. It's a very clever ruse of capitalism to make workers think they're not even working class when they're in this class struggle. And that's a barrier you have to overcome, I think, at some point. But that's where it's going to come from. It's going to come from, as Verity says, from the bottom, from workers being aware of the exploitation and the need to change that exploitation. And part of that are these other struggles. Climate change or other things are part of what's going to have to happen to. So climate change will make people more increasingly aware of the problems of capitalism. So no question of that. Yeah.
The class, we talk about the class war and the class struggle, but the struggle and the class war needs two sides. Now, the ruling class is always attacking the working class, but I haven't seen any evidence where the working class, as a whole class, is responding. We respond in a fragmented way, like the waterfront dispute, like the big, when Clary O'Shea was jailed and we had a million workers walk off the job, which had been prepared for quite a few years, which was a wonderful result, and so on. But that's the nearest we've ever come, 1 million people, to what we would really call a class struggle, where all the classes working together. There's just no evidence of it. In fact, nowadays it's worse than what it ever did because of the demise of unions and so on, and the fact that we don't have huge numbers of workers. Working in the one plant. The biggest single employer under the one roof in Australia is the big bloody where all the gambling goes on. The Crown Casino.
Yeah.
8,000 people. Could we have ever imagined years ago that a casino would be the biggest single employer in the country? When I was a shop steward,
26,000.
There
is Australian Post with about 26,000.
Yeah, I'm talking about sort of in the one place basically. And it was just not unusual when I was young. In my workplace at CIG Gases, we had about 800 or 900 blue collar workers under the one roof. At Ford's, there was several thousand under the one roof. And all that dissipates class, thinking and solidarity and so on. We could never have foreseen that. The auto industry is completely gone. We had thousands of well-organised, good, strong union people there. Where it's all coming from, I don't know. But there's no evidence that workers are wanting to come together and battle as a class.
Tony, did you have a question?
Oh yeah, I mean it's been talked about a little bit. I guess I'd say from listening to Verity's historical account, it seemed a little bit like, Lenin famously said that Australia's kind of a funny place because you've got a Labor Party, which really like a bourgeois liberal party, and then you've got a Liberal Party, which is kind of quite a conservative party. I'd say, to what extent has the Labor Party been an obstacle to the independence of working class politics in this country from its inception? And you said that there was people that thought it at the time. And I'd say also this kind of relates to the problem of the state in capitalism. So to what extent is they say the Democratic Party in America is where the graveyard of social movements, for example. I think that's related to the problem of the state in capitalism. So is the state the most immediate enemy of the working class, or would that be a vulgarization?
Thanks. Verity, would you like?
Yeah. Do you mean the state or the Labor Party? I mean, the Labor Party, its existence has certainly dampened down working class aspirations and struggles. There's no doubt about that. The state, do you mean that you have to have an analysis that says the state cannot be captured, it has to be smashed and overcome, as in the sort of classical Leninist position?
I guess I was getting into kind of some of your history there around maybe the crisis kind of emerging in Marxism around the world, around World War I in particular. So you have the IWW, like you were saying, the fights against conscription and stuff, and it's the Labor Party that ultimately, gets the police force going and gets the Labor Party that's ultimately not just dampening this struggle, but is the representative of the ruling class against the working class, you could say, at that time. And it was a kind of terrible necessity to try and, before the 1925 election, for example, they kicked them all out. Like you read Dora Montfire and those people talking about this is how the Labor Party dupes the working class, and maybe the Labor Party is the kind of the old-fashioned, to use an old-fashioned Marxist expression, like the kind of Bonapartist representative of that they take the social discontents and that doesn't matter what kind of class struggle. Exactly, yeah.
It's absolutely true. So there is this perennial problem that the Labor Party has been bad for class struggle, but workers are still nonetheless convinced that it's the lesser evil. But that's the same thing. The fact that they think that it's the lesser evil is part of the process of class struggle being diffused and deflected.
I had a huge impact when I first read Gramsci when he came out in English in about 1970, and I read all that stuff. And it was a really exciting read because it really brought a whole new approach to the fact that workers were imbibing capitalism and in a way that nobody else had sort of thought through like Gramsci did. And therefore, part of the big struggle is the ideological struggle of getting around that, because the overwhelming number of workers today, no matter in what capacity, think capitalism's pretty good. There is some thinking among some younger ones now about maybe it's not so good, especially when you've got a bloody, bid for jobs and all that. But I thought Gramsci was very helpful in understanding that.
And I think part of the it's probably happened naturally, but part of the way capitalism has also taken people away from class struggle and awareness is urban sprawl itself. I mean, years ago, inner urban areas were factories and workshops, and people all worked together. They had a sense of being working class together and struggled together. the the eviction struggles of the Depression, when people in local communities fought for each other. But now, the hell of a lot of people get in a car in the office car park, drive out to their home in the quarter-acre block somewhere in the wild suburbs, and have no other relationship with the human race. In terms of seeing themselves as workers, I think that's played a key role, that they've really spread out the idea of workers in geographic terms, and workers feel less part of their own working class. I think that's part of it.
Is there any more questions from the room? Steve?
Just going on some of the themes that the panel's raised about politics coming out of struggle and the diminishing of that struggle. Obviously, we very much feel that today, but I was just thinking about how the Labour Party got started and the background to that, and because from my very sketchy reading of 19th century history, is that the ALP was formed in the wake of a lot of tensions and defeats in the labour movement.
1891.
Yeah, particularly the really big strike at
Shearers strike
or something.
Maritime.
1890 maritime strike.
Yeah. So, can we see it then as a party of departure from something that came before it? Because a couple of you talked about it in the early 20th century as the party of Labour. So can we call it a party of Labour at that time if it came into being as a result of these departures and declines and defeats? I don't know.
Well, the argument was that you had to send trade union representatives into Parliament so that the party in Parliament would act as a shield to protect the industrial working class in their struggles. It was because of the defeat that you had to pursue a parliamentary strategy in order to ensure that the state power was not used so viciously against workers like it was in the 1890 maritime strike and the 1891 shearers strike. But then you have the irony of, the Chifley government in 1949 sending troops in to crush the miners' strike, which just shows what happens when you pursue a strategy with a certain end that ends up actually doing the opposite. Which is what the Wobblies always said would happen.
Mm. See, the problem with the formation, the way we went about it, because it was union who'd been through big defeats at the time, we had the strong syndicalist thinking coming through and influencing the Labour Party. Not so much, there was very little kind of other political thinking like any Marxists in the time involved with that. That came through the smaller groups later on. And then it's never had a big hold in the Labour Party, although some of, as Kevin said earlier on, some of the good left people had strong Marxist background. But I make a comparison, having been in Scandinavia and the Nordic on a number of occasions. The thing that I found out, which was really interesting, was that the formation of the Social Democrats and other parties there was actually, the Social Democrats were formed in about the 1880 or mid-1880s by people who actually were Marxists, who'd worked with Marx and Engels. And quite a few of the unions by then there was only a handful of unions because it wasn't highly industrialised. So what happened was the new Social Democrats, with what was then quite a strong Marxist influence, they formed quite a few of the unions and were very conscious about forming industry-wide unions, which was really quite important. They thought that through with that background. And what struck me in the times I've been there is that influence is still there. The unions in Norway and Sweden, which I know best, are very, very political. They think politically much more than do our unions. And I wondered why that was, and then I found out that background was sort of coming through to this day. and they're still very powerful. I mean, you know, much more powerful than we are, the unions. I mean, Sweden is still 75% membership. Norway, it's just dropped a bit below 50. But yeah, it's really interesting how those cultures over 100 years or more keep coming through, and they're the different experiences.
I think another important factor at the moment, and I know it's got a great positive that superannuation gives a cushion to workers on retirement. And the moment the government, for its own purposes, wants to wrest all that money away and give it to the bankers, and it's holding inquiries into it. But there's the other side of it, that they've got it so big now that you've actually got workers employing workers, and workers therefore exploiting workers, to the stage where, and this is another way in which workers are going to be separated from thinking about class struggle, I think, because we recently had a full-page ad in the financial pages from a union opposing their employer. I think it was Ausgrid, the New South Wales distributor, but it's owned by AusSuper and Australian Super and another number of other super companies, super organisations. And so you've now got, and there's recently with CBus as well, CBus is trying to lower conditions of its own workers. And even the State Secretary of the CFMEU in Queensland has urged his members to get out of it. So, you know, that's a further problem as I see it. It's another way in which workers are going to be divorced from thinking about their class struggle in a sense, and you've also got workers almost exploiting themselves in many ways with the investments they're making. They're becoming so big. So, you know, so you've now got worker organisations becoming just part of capitalism.
And the CBus builds such shit buildings too around the city.
Well, that's the other side. CBus is probably one of the biggest developer of office space in those big bloody developments around cities. While below them, you've got people on the street who can't find a bloody home with a roof over their head.
Imagine trying to get them to run a green bag.
Yeah, exactly. Can I make a very quick comment?
Sure.
There's a union comrade I know who was an organiser, at least around construction, for a period of time, a very dedicated one. And I remember he said once that CBus was the most anti-union employer he'd ever encountered in his long decade as an organiser across various workforces, across various unions. The most anti-union employer.
Gee, that's interesting.
Well, their stance has given the other employers the way out, because the super funds have been saying increases in the levy won't affect wages, and CBus is now saying to its workers, if there's an increase, we're going to lower your wages. So the big bosses now, the capitalism generally is now using that and saying, aha, we told you, and so they've given them ammunition as well.
Okay, well, we might wrap up there because we've just gone.
Two points quickly.
Oh, very quickly, yep.
I was saying before about books, and I get sick of people raising all the big problems without making any suggestions of what you might do. There's a very good book, Paul Adler's book. He's actually an Australian who's lived for many years in America, a professor who I've known since he was a student. Very good book he's written called The 99%. And he's one who not only talks about the problems, but he has a whole lot of quite creative thinking about what you do. It's probably not very cheap, that book, but I found it quite valuable about, he's an academic for once, who's really thinking about how you change things around.
Not very cheap, but quite valuable.
I think it's available on Library Genesis.
Yeah, it's worth a read. It's only about 160 pages, but very well worth a read. The 99%. And I've got a few copies of my book there if you want to buy it.
That's the real book you need to buy. That's got all the real answers in it. Oh well, that concludes our event. I want to thank all the panelists, Verity, Max, Kevin and David, for participating. I think this was a really interesting and productive discussion, and hopefully we'll continue on through responses to this event in the Platypus Review. I already know Shirley is going to turn her comments into a response. And so I want to thank the organising committee for this panel, and Maddie and the team at the New International Bookshop for accommodating us through the chaos of the pandemic. Later in the summer, we are planning a panel on the question, what is the Party for Socialism, relating to the topic of the Victorian Socialists, a self-described proto-party and its relation to socialist politics. So please follow us on Facebook, Instagram at Platypus Melbourne for updates on that. Let's give the panelists one more round of applause. And I'm sure all of us are going to head over to the curtain and debrief and relax a bit and continue the conversation.